In 1959, 12 nations signed a treaty that did something unprecedented. They took an entire continent, a landmass larger than Europe, rich with resources, and agreed that none of them would claim it. Not the United States, not the Soviet Union, not Britain, France, or any other signatory. They agreed to leave it untouched forever. This was 1959, the height of the Cold War. The Berlin Wall would go up 2 years later. The Cuban Missile Crisis was 3 years away. The United States and the Soviet Union were fighting proxy wars on 3 continents, racing to develop nuclear arsenals that could end civilization. And yet, they agreed on Antarctica. Completely. No exploitation, no militarization, no territorial claims. The treaty has been renewed multiple times. No signatory has ever seriously violated it. Not once in 65 years. Now here is the question nobody asks. Why would competitors do that? Why would nations locked in zero-sum competition agree to collectively ignore an entire resource-rich continent? The official answer is scientific cooperation and environmental preservation. Except that the treaty was signed 14 years before the first major environmental legislation passed in any signatory nation. The Clean Air Act in the United States came in 1963. The environmental movement did not exist as a political force in 1959. These nations were strip mining their own territories, dumping industrial waste into rivers, testing nuclear weapons in the atmosphere. So the official explanation does not hold. Something else was happening. Something that made exploitation of Antarctica undesirable for reasons never made public. 20 years later, a similar pattern emerged in the Arctic. By 1982, the nations with Arctic territorial claims had established a framework that effectively froze territorial expansion beyond existing claims. Then in 1996, they formalized this with the Arctic Council, which prevents any single nation from unilateral resource exploitation. 2 poles, 2 separate treaty systems, same result. Coordinated restraint from nations that restrain nothing else. The standard explanation is that ice makes extraction prohibitively expensive, but this explanation persists even as ice melts and technology advances. Shell Oil spent $7 billion between 2005 and 2015 developing Arctic drilling. They pulled out because regulatory barriers made it politically unviable. Barriers maintained by the same Arctic Council framework that the resource-hungry nations themselves created. Why spend $7 billion developing technology and then create a framework preventing its use? Unless the framework was not designed to prevent extraction. Unless it was designed to prevent discovery. The Antarctic Treaty has 3 core provisions. It prohibits military activity. It prohibits mineral exploitation. And it prohibits nuclear testing and radioactive waste disposal. The third one is odd. In 1959, every nuclear power was testing weapons in remote areas. Antarctica is the most remote place on Earth, yet the treaty specifically bans nuclear explosions there. As a separate, distinct prohibition, why? One possibility is that nuclear devices were considered as tools, not weapons. Project Plowshare in the United States, nuclear explosions for the national economy in the Soviet Union. Both programs explored using nuclear detonations for large-scale excavation. A single explosion could move more earth than months of conventional digging. The Panama Canal was proposed for nuclear widening. The Soviets used nuclear explosions to create underground storage cavities for natural gas. Between 1965 and 1988, the Soviet program conducted over 100 nuclear detonations for civilian purposes. This was not fringe science. This was official government policy actively implemented. Now consider this in the context of Antarctica. The continent is covered by an ice sheet that averages 1 mile thick. In some places, it is nearly 3 miles thick. Under that ice is rock. We know the rock is there because ice-penetrating radar has mapped it, and the rock, based on the limited geological surveys that have been conducted, contains the same mineral deposits you would expect in any continental landmass: coal, iron, possibly rare earth elements, possibly uranium. If you wanted to access those deposits, you would need to excavate through a mile of ice. Conventional methods would take years and cost billions. A nuclear excavation could theoretically do it in a matter of months. So here is the timeline. In the 1950s, nuclear excavation is being actively explored by the superpowers. In 1959, those same superpowers sign a treaty that specifically bans nuclear explosions in Antarctica. In the 1960s, nuclear excavation programs continue in both countries for civil engineering purposes. In 1963, the Partial Test Ban Treaty bans nuclear testing in the atmosphere, underwater and in outer space, but not underground. Underground testing continues for another 30 years, but Antarctica remains off limits, completely and permanently. The pattern suggests that something specific about Antarctica made nuclear excavation undesirable. Not the ice, not the cold, not the logistics. Those are challenges, not prohibitions. The treaty language is a prohibition agreed to by nations that were otherwise competing for every possible strategic advantage. And the same pattern shows up in the Arctic, where the technology to drill through ice has existed since the 1970s, but large-scale exploitation has been systematically delayed by regulatory frameworks that the drilling nations themselves created. What is under the ice that makes leaving it there more valuable than extracting it? The revisionist hypothesis, and this is where mainstream historians and economists diverge from the evidence, is that the poles are not being protected because of what is under the ice. They are being protected because of what the ice itself records. Ice core samples from Antarctica and Greenland provide the most detailed climate record available to science. Cores drilled to depths of 2 miles contain ice that is over 800,000 years old. Each layer of ice traps air bubbles from the year it was deposited. Those bubbles contain atmospheric gas ratios, oxygen isotope levels, particulate matter, volcanic ash, industrial pollutants. The ice is a physical archive of the atmosphere, and the atmosphere is a record of what was happening on the surface of the planet. If you drill an ice core from Antarctica and analyze the layers, you can read the atmospheric composition for each year going back nearly 1 million years. You can identify volcanic eruptions, you can track carbon dioxide levels, you can detect large-scale fires, you can identify periods of intense industrial activity based on lead and sulfur particulate concentrations. And this is where the timeline becomes interesting again, because ice core drilling technology was developed in the 1950s. The first deep ice cores were extracted from Greenland and Antarctica in the 1960s. The data from those cores was published in scientific journals, and the data showed something unexpected. The ice cores showed elevated levels of industrial pollutants, specifically lead, and copper particulates in layers that dated to time periods well before the Industrial Revolution. Layers from the Roman period showed lead concentrations consistent with large-scale smelting operations. This was published. It was peer-reviewed. It was accepted as evidence that the Roman Empire had engaged in mining and metallurgy at a scale significant enough to affect global atmospheric composition. The journals documented it. The scientific community acknowledged it. Then deeper cores were drilled. And the deeper cores, the ones going back 10,000 years, 20,000 years, 50,000 years, showed similar spikes. Elevated metal particulates, elevated carbon levels, patterns that looked remarkably like industrial activity in time periods that, according to the standard historical timeline, should have been entirely pre-industrial. The initial response from the scientific community was to reinterpret the data. The spikes were attributed to volcanic activity, to natural forest fires, to meteorite impacts, anything except human industrial activity, because human industrial activity at that scale was not supposed to exist in those time periods. But here is the problem with that reinterpretation. Volcanic ash has a specific signature. You can identify which volcano produced it based on the chemical composition. Forest fire residue has a different signature than coal burning. Meteorite impacts leave iridium. The spikes in the deep ice cores do not match those signatures. They match industrial signatures: copper smelting, lead refining, coal combustion, and the pattern is global. Cores from Antarctica show it, cores from Greenland show it, cores from the Himalayas show it. Whatever was producing those atmospheric signatures was happening at a scale large enough to affect the entire planet. Now, this is where mainstream science and revisionist analysis split. Mainstream science, confronted with data that does not fit the established timeline, adjusts the interpretation of the data to preserve the timeline. Revisionist analysis suggests you should do the opposite, adjust the timeline to fit the data. If the ice cores show industrial activity 20,000 years ago, then there was industrial activity 20,000 years ago. And if there was industrial activity at that scale, then there was a civilization capable of producing it. And if that civilization existed, then the historical record we have been given for that period is incomplete. Not wrong, incomplete. Because civilizations leave evidence, architecture, infrastructure, metallurgy, agriculture, and we have found evidence of all of those things in time periods that are supposed to be pre-civilizational. We have found cities in Turkey that date to 9,000 years ago. We have found agricultural sites in the Levant that date to 11,000 years ago. We have found metallurgical sites in the Balkans that date to 7,000 years ago. What we have not found, or what we have not acknowledged, is evidence of those civilizations operating at industrial scale, at the scale that would produce the atmospheric signatures the ice cores are recording. And this brings us back to the poles, because the poles are where the evidence is most complete and most protected. The ice preserves everything. It preserves atmospheric composition. It preserves organic material. It preserves the timeline in layers that cannot be easily disturbed or reinterpreted. If you wanted to suppress evidence of pre-modern industrial civilizations, the most effective way to do it would be to prevent anyone from conducting comprehensive, independent analysis of the polar ice record. And the most effective way to prevent that analysis would be to create a treaty system that limits access, controls research permissions, and ensures that any data collected is filtered through institutions that have a vested interest in preserving the standard timeline. The Antarctic Treaty does exactly that. Research in Antarctica requires government approval from the treaty nations. Data collected in Antarctica is subject to international review processes. Independent researchers cannot simply travel to Antarctica and drill ice cores. The logistics are controlled entirely by the signatory nations. The funding comes exclusively from government agencies or institutions dependent on government grants. The interpretation of the data is conducted by institutions that depend on those governments for their continued existence and operational budgets. This is not a conspiracy in the sense of a secret cabal meeting in a smoke-filled room. This is a structural arrangement, a framework that produces the outcome of limited, controlled access to the most complete geological and atmospheric record available on the planet. And the outcome of that framework is that certain questions do not get asked, certain data does not get collected, certain interpretations do not get published in peer-reviewed journals. The framework shapes what can be known and what remains officially unknown through the quiet, bureaucratic mechanisms of controlled access and approved interpretation. The poles hold the same secret because the poles are the same kind of archive. Antarctica preserves the southern hemisphere atmospheric record. The Arctic preserves the northern hemisphere atmospheric record. Together they provide a complete atmospheric and climate history of the planet going back nearly 1 million years. A history that, if read without the constraints of the standard timeline, might reveal that the Dark Ages were not dark, the pre-industrial periods were not pre-industrial, and the empty millennia were not empty. The treaty system ensures that reading never happens, not through explicit censorship, but through the quiet, bureaucratic mechanism of controlled access and approved interpretation. The stumps are still there, the ice cores are still there, the record exists. But the record is locked behind permissions and protocols and funding requirements that ensure only certain people read it and only certain conclusions are drawn. This is the architecture of managed ignorance, not dramatic, not cinematic, just structural. Just a treaty that says leave it alone, and a framework that ensures compliance, and a timeline that remains unchallenged because the evidence that would challenge it remains unread. If you made it this far, you are not a casual viewer. You are someone who asks what is missing from the story. Share this with someone who asks the same questions. That is how this kind of research moves, not through institutions, through the people who cannot stop noticing the gaps. Stay curious, stay skeptical. The ice remembers everything. The question is whether we will read it before the frameworks that protect it become permanent.